So welcome back to the next part of the interview. I am so delighted to speak with Jennifer Condie, a longtime student of mine who's a piano teacher and has found interesting ways to apply what we are doing in my studio when she teaches in her studio. And so this segment will look at how Jennifer is applying Alexander principles when she works with piano students in her studio. So welcome, Jennifer. I'm so happy you're doing this with me. So you have Alexander lessons and then you go to your teaching studio. How do you take what you're learning as a student and use it with your students?
Well, the first thing I would say is that you can't overstate the importance of modeling. That I know that because I sit differently and move differently and listen differently, that my students do as well. So I really can see that shifting as I shift. With my younger students, I'll talk about sort of how I started using it and what some of my sort of fundamental things I do all the time are. The first thing is I work on arm release standing with my students and ask them to think up as they release their arms and ask them to observe their arms as they fall and ask them to get them to be aware of when they wish to tighten as their arms have released. Because if they can't catch their own tendency to tighten, then it's not going to be very helpful with their playing. The other one I do, which is actually my favorite, I'd say it's the thing I like doing the most, is arms above the head, breathe out, bend the knees, think up, and then allow the arms to move, because it's a pretty complex movement. And if I don't think up, it causes me problems, especially wearing certain shoes. And so I know that it requires quite a lot of coordination, thinking, and practice for them to be really comfortable with it.
So basically what you're describing is a sequence, sending directions in a sequence,
yeah.
Paying attention to what it is that is happening, what to stop, observing oneself, and attending to coordination. So what is the actual activity?
Well, let's try with me demonstrating it. I'll make sure I move back far enough that they can see, because that seems like the easiest way to explain. Okay. But I need to be on the carpet here because I'll slip on the tile. So I ask them to move their hands above their head, and we work on not lifting the shoulders while doing this, and to think of releasing their neck. Although if they haven't had Alexander lessons or Gaby's hands on them, I think there's a limit to what they can get from that. So then I ask them to think up as they breathe out and release their arms, and notice when they want to tighten, like this. And you see, I didn't think up enough, so now I'm falling over. Like I said, if I'm not thinking well, I don't do it well. Now, I wasn't thinking up enough, I didn't fall over.
And so when you say I didn't think up enough,
I didn't stay with my up thinking.
Right.
Got distracted. So
by the recording, by me looking, by all of it.
Someone's watching me, that makes it scary. Students aren't as scary.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
And so when you do this with students, are they able to do it?
Yes. In fact, it's quite interesting how well most of them can do it. But you certainly can see the difference between people's coordination when I do it. Some students literally just spring through it. And then you can see also how students change over time. I've actually had a student who, as a younger person, really sprung. You could see she was extremely coordinated, and as she's getting a little bit older, I'm going to have to work a bit more with her, actually, because life is affecting her coordination in a more general way, and it's going to take more thinking for her to to stay that way. Like it's interesting. And then others start off with more challenges and just continue to improve. That's been interesting over the time since we started doing this, because those are things I didn't necessarily anticipate, especially that I would have to work harder with some students as they get older and as their own coordination changes.
So when you do that, how do you say to students, okay, we're going to do some Alexander now? Or do you speak about the concepts as abstract concepts? Or are you explaining what is needed for the activity and then you move to the piano?
I mostly would just explain what's needed for the activity and then move to the piano, because the students, most of them are young enough, like let's say the ones between 5 and 12, they don't really care what it's from. So but with teenagers, I'm more likely to talk about it being an Alexander concept and explain more about it. And I tend to do more explaining with those who are most curious, because some kids are really not super interested. If I start explaining it, they just tune out anyway. So it depends a lot on who I'm working with and how they respond.
And can they tell a difference in the piano?
Yes, they can. Like but I wouldn't say specifically like necessarily with that exercise itself, but when we work on, say, freeing the shoulder girdle and moving the wrist, and we're playing 4-note chords and they've already played them for me, and they're kind of, so many kids have a tendency to go down and want to push, and they can tell a difference. It certainly becomes freer. And as my students get older, some of them have grown quite a lot in how they move. One of the most interesting explorations lately is very much Alexander technique, because it's more indirect, which is thinking of your sit bone and your fingertip. And I actually find with students who have some experience, that is the most amazing shift. Not only does the sound open up for them, but they feel more grounded in the keyboard.
So it's not just indirect, but you have a clear sense of opposition.
Yeah, really, really wonderful sense of opposition. And then the other one that you gave me early on for my own playing that I use a lot is just how you use the pedal, like that you're not pushing the pedal down, that you're extending your foot and that has the opposition from the ankle. And I do sometimes talk about opposition. Just again, it depends. But that is really helpful, because so many people tighten and push, and then your pedaling is very awkward. And if you get that control, it works much better.
Thank you. So would you say that whether directly or indirectly, whether explicitly or implicitly, that your teaching has changed?
I'd say my teaching has changed so much that sometimes I almost find it hard to remember how I taught before I started Alexander technique lessons. And what I'm finding interesting is that I can hear it in my students playing as a group, some more than others, but when I sit and listen to them play, the sound is more complex. It's more open, it's more fluent, and with ones who are really interested in how it works. Like we've also been working with multiple awarenesses with my older ones, because that's a really useful concept, like the open awareness idea of being aware of how you're moving and how you're listening. And you can really hear that in their playing when they're in a bigger space. You can hear them doing that. But that would be certain students, because they're all at different levels. And so it depends on the level they're at, what ideas I present to them and use with them in their lessons. You have to have I think in order to use some of those things, you have to be on your sit bones and be able to release, because you have to have a little bit of a hierarchy, I think, of what you teach them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And this concludes part 2 of our 3-part interview.